Joining us now is the former speechwriter for the Trump White House, the investigative journalist and founder of Revolver News, and I'd like to say a friend of System Update, someone who's becoming a regular guest, Darren Beattie. Darren, it's great to see you as always. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So one of the episodes that you have done, I would say the best work on reporting on and investigating, is the January 6th riot, and in particular things that are being hidden and concealed about that investigation, in particular the role that the FBI might have played in that the events on the ground that day, the role that their informants and agents have played. January 6th seems to have kind of disappeared from the discourse, except with regard to the issue we just talked about, which is the attempt to hold President Trump criminally liable by, hopefully, in the view of liberals, indicting him for that speech. What else is it that's going on when it comes to this investigation?
Well, there's been a pretty remarkable development recently, and people who followed our work at revolver.news know that we've covered what I've termed the Fedsurrection from a variety of angles, but my position has always been there are two real smoking guns of this Fedsurrection. One is the curious case of Ray Epps, which I believe we've discussed in a prior episode, and the other is the still more curious and I would say damning case of the January 6th pipe bomb. Now, we've reported a variety of things about this, from how the official story is impossible in terms of how the pipe bomb by the RNC was allegedly found, to how the DNC pipe bomb wasn't found, to how they covered up the fact that Kamala Harris was in the DNC building for over a year, and therefore, the Secret Service swept the area and for some reason didn't find the pipe bomb, even though it allegedly had live explosives. Maybe the Secret Service dogs had COVID that day. So there are just so many things that don't add up, including the forensic material, the surveillance footage that the FBI presented to the public about this. And we've covered how they're hiding critical footage from the public, and finally, that they've artificially tampered with the frame rate so as to make it impossible to identify this person, that a certain individual presented the public saying, we need your help finding him. And here's where the story really gets interesting, because that person, that public face of the pipe bomb investigation, is someone called Stephen D'Antuono. Now, I suspect on the basis of our pretty devastating reporting on the pipe bomb, he quietly retired from his coveted position running the field office, and now he's a humble accountant at KPMG. But he's come out of his accounting firm to subject himself to interrogation by the Judiciary Committee voluntarily. Now, here's really something kind of wild. So he talked about a variety of things. First, he talked about the Mar-a-Lago raid, which is interesting. He came forward and basically said the Mar-a-Lago raid, which is the basis of the sham indictment of Trump, probably the penultimate one before the J6 indictment, that the Mar-a-Lago raid was not legitimate. And he emphasized 3 or 4 pretty critical points where there was a deviation from protocol that he said didn't make sense. They were outsourcing regular jobs from the FBI to counterintelligence officials, so forth. So I thought this was weird for an FBI guy, and let alone this guy, who I neglected to say, before serving as the head of the Washington field office in the months leading up to and after January 6th, he was the guy who oversaw the now fully disgraced and discredited entrapment operation that was the so-called Michigan Fednapping plot, the kidnapping plot with Whitmer. So he has a pretty decorated resume in terms of dirty jobs against Trump. And this guy, of all people, is coming forward voluntarily, pouring water on the Mar-a-Lago raid, and I say even more shockingly, actually answering questions about the pipe bomb. He could have said this is an active investigation like they always do. He actually answered questions. Now, for the full story, I'd encourage people to go to the site revolver.news, but here's one really interesting bombshell from that. So he was asked,
before you get into this newest bombshell, just remind people of the kind of centrality that this allegation had on January 6th and the days after about the iconography of January 6th and the reason it was so dangerous. What were the claims about this pipe bomber or the pipe bomb?
Well, the kind of the context of it, the contextual implication, given that January 6th is presented to be this domestic terrorist event, the worst in America's history, according to many Democrat elected officials, that the pipe bombs were that was the closest thing to anything resembling conventional terrorism about January 6th. So they're making a huge deal about it. And in fact, a recent report from the Washington Post revealed that they had 50 FBI agents on this case, which is pretty remarkable and gives a sense of how high profile it was. They were saying that this is one of their highest profile investigations, which makes it all the more remarkable when we start to learn about just the absolute malfeasance, just the basics. They didn't even do the basics. But here's what they asked Stephen D'Antonio. They said, "We know you guys have been using geofencing technology to identify other January 6th participants. Have you used geofencing to identify this pipe bomber depicted in the surveillance footage?" And multiple accounts, I've been close to the people who were involved in this, multiple accounts said his body language clammed up, started to get fidgety. Eye contact was much more difficult at that point. And he said, yes, we did actually attempt to identify this person with geofencing, but the telecom company came back to us and said, for this specific request, unfortunately, the data is corrupted. And then he said, look, it was basically, I know this looks bad. I can't explain it. This is extremely unusual, but I don't want to encourage any conspiracies, guys. He literally said that. That's the best he had. And so basically the dog ate the geofencing data. It must have been the same dog that ate the Epstein tapes. It must have been the same dog that ate the surveillance footage that depicted John Doe 2 in Oklahoma City. There's a dog that's very hungry for a very specific type of surveillance footage, who is one of these government dogs that you hear acclaimed in the media so often. So it's a very strange story, and that was just one of several bombshells that really just reinforces the reporting that we've done and shows that even the guy who is the public face of it and the nominal head of this investigation basically admits in more or less terms that the investigation doesn't make any sense. He finds it weird. And, I think we can all draw our conclusions about that.
I've always been so interested in the reaction to your reporting. I remember the first time the question was raised about whether the FBI knew about these events or had agents on the ground. The New York Times actually reported that they had at least one informant on the ground as the events were unfolding. And the idea was, this is a horrible conspiracy theory, even though liberals had spent the entire war on terror. It was one of the things on which I reported the most, documenting the fact that the FBI constantly incited its own plots, directed its own plots. They recruited vulnerable Muslims, young Muslim men who were either vulnerable financially or because of mental health problems, and turned them into terrorists, convinced them to join the FBI's own plots, and then would break up the plot at the last second and heroically pat themselves on the back for the way they kept the country safe. So the fact that the FBI does this sort of stuff is well documented, and yet there was this rage against even suggesting that the FBI might have played a role in facilitating these events. And in particular, when it comes to Ray Epps, they finally did have to respond. Their last response was that 60 Minutes interview where they basically turned him into a victim, talked about how terrible it was that the allegations were being made against him. We all saw the videos where Ray Epps was inciting and urging people to go into the Capitol and break in and use violence to do so. And it's so notable that many people who didn't even allegedly use violence have been prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and yet no one's interested in him. And it seems like the claim has been, if you mention Ray Epps, you're going to get sued, and it means you're guilty of harassment. But and I'm asking this earnestly, has the United States government, the Biden administration, the FBI, its media servants, offered any explanation at all as to why Ray Epps has never been prosecuted, even though if you look at the videos of him, he clearly did infinitely more than the vast majority of people who have been prosecuted to encourage and incite these events?
No, there's no innocent explanation in my mind for the extraordinary degree of protection that he's enjoyed. Protection on the part of the Department of Justice and protection on the part of the media, which I would have to conclude from that, and I'll say as a matter of my informed opinion, because he has retained a David Brock rubber stamped lawyer, and they're going around threatening everyone with defamation suits, when he himself, it's revealed in text messages, literally texted his nephew saying, quote, "I orchestrated it." So he should begin by suing himself, because I haven't even come out to say anything that explicit about his participation on January 6th. No, there's no explanation for it that's innocent. And it's even more than that, because I think if you're a low-level informant, the feds have a long and storied history not only of having informants, but burning informants when they become inconvenient. So the fact that Ray Epps wasn't burned indicates that, I think we can only speculate from there, but I think this wasn't his first rodeo, and they may be more concerned about some other things in his possible participation with them that they don't want to come to light. But he truly is enjoying an extraordinary degree of protection that's not really consistent with any innocent explanation, in my view.
Yeah, and there's an aggression to prevent people from even talking about him, as I said, including basically implying that there will be some very big law firms suing. They're threatening to sue Tucker Carlson and Fox for having asked these questions. So they're clearly trying to create a climate where no one's allowed to ask these questions any longer, and I find that very revealing.
And it has been effective to a degree. I won't name the institution, but there is a media institution that I know for a fact simply won't talk about Epps anymore on the basis of this. And it's not Fox News. Fox News, like, Tucker was the only guy who would dare talk about it anyway, but there are other conservative media institutions that will not talk about Epps for one reason or another, and it's probably because of the defamation threats. But Epps is the one smoking gun. The other is the pipe bomb. I find it amazing, this geofencing story. And just to add a little tidbit to that, because there are two types of geofencing. One is available to law enforcement, where they go directly to the telecom company. There's another kind of alternative route where you use geofencing through apps that are plugged into GPS. And there are big data services that collect this information, so it cashes out effectively as a geofencing tool. And there's a handful of big data firms in the country that just sell this as a business. And I'm a known quantity, so I knew they wouldn't want to do business with me. But I got a proxy who is very clean in terms of his political reputation, who is in this world, who has every position to do that sort of business, make inquiries to a number of these firms, and there are only a handful of them. And in each case, the initial reception was very warm, as in, we're happy to do business, we're happy to take your money. And then within 1 to 2 days, there was an answer with a much different tone, basically saying, this isn't something we're able to do. So if that's happening on the commercial side, and we're getting corrupted data from the telecom, according to the FBI, you'd think there's got to be some other way they can get to this. I mean, if we have the NSA spying on us anyway, they clearly have it. There are probably a bunch of other intelligence agencies that have it. It's simply not believable, but again, I think it goes to show the lengths to which the regime is willing to go to cover up this specific narrative is pretty extraordinary, up to the level of, in all likelihood, tampering with this geofencing data, such as to make it very difficult to identify this pipe bomber to the public, which, in my opinion, I think they know who it is, and that person is severely inconvenient to the narrative that they've presented to the public for years now, and they're covering it up.
Yeah, and again, the lack of interest in finding out who that person is by both the media and by the government is extremely striking. Now, Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.